Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. We're in week 46 and it's quite a momentous week because this is the last block that is going to make up the centre of our quilt topper. So if you're new here and you're not sure what we're doing, we have spent 2023 making a quilt on a garden theme. We've made roughly one block a week. Some weeks we've made more than one block and some blocks have taken more than 1 week, but we are now at the end of that process and we're about to start on the process of putting our quilt together. So if you would like to go back to the beginning and watch these videos from the start of the series, I will put a playlist at the top of the screen so that you can click on that and go back and have a look at all the things that we've done this year and maybe have a go at making your own garden quilt. So let me start this week by taking around what I've got on my table. This week my backing fabric is going to be my red random spot, and I've cut a piece that is 20 by 20 centimetres. Obviously you don't need to use exactly the same fabrics as me, but I wanted something that was a little bit speckly for the background. I've also got a piece of white fabric. This is a vintage linen, but any white fabric will do. And I've got an embroidery hoop which should give you a bit of a clue about what we're going to get up to today. I've got a heat erase pen and my embroidery scissors, and I've got some of the threads from my colour scheme. So these are all Anchor brand. It's my brand of choice, but you can substitute for whatever threads you like to use. So I've got my white, which is 001. I've got my yellow, which is 298, my pink, which is 025, my red, which is 046, my light green, which is 255, my mid green, which is 258, and my darkest green, which is 683. And I do actually use a little bit of blue, and my blue is 130. And this week there is a template available. We are going to do some silk shading or thread painting, and we're going to kind of do a cheats version. So if you've never done that before, don't worry, I'll make this really easy for you. And we're going to make a seed packet. So I will put the address at the bottom of the screen for you so that you can go and get that. It costs £1 to download this from our website. It's just a nominal charge to help cover the cost of making these videos and to keep this channel running. If you feel confident sketching your own, just go for it. Please don't feel obliged to download it, but it's there if you need it. So to start, I'm going to trace through my white fabric, and I've actually already done this. I'm not going to demonstrate it today because I've shown this so many times in different videos, but I'm just laying my fabric over the template and tracing through the key lines. So you can see that you see quite well. I've also marked the corner points of my seed packet just so that I've got a sense of where the boundary of my embroidery should be, and you might want to mark those in a water erase pen because they are likely to get erased as we go through this process. So I've done this with a heat erase pen. I use my light box, but as always, if you don't have a light box, you can just hold it up to the window. It's fairly easy to see through, and the only other lines that I've added are some little strokes on the petals and leaves that give me a little bit of an idea which direction I want my stitches to travel in on each petal. So that's just a little bit of a guide for when I'm stitching. If I just hold it up, you can see that as soon as there's light behind it, you can trace through really easily. So not a problem if you don't have a light box. If you're worried about things slipping as you're tracing it, you can always just put a little bit of washi tape or masking tape at the top to hold everything in place. So I'm going to put this in my hoop. I've got a small 4-inch hoop here, and I'm only actually going to put this floral section in the hoop because this is the bit where we're going to be using satin stitch, and satin stitch really benefits from being done with fabric in a hoop. All I'm going to do is separate the 2 rings of the hoop, put the solid ring down on the table, lay the fabric over the top, and then loosen off the outer ring a little bit and push it down over the surface of the fabric. And if I want to tighten it, the best way to do it is to pull on diagonal corners, so pull them into the centre like this, and that way you won't distort your design too much. If you pull up and down, that's actually going with the weave of the fabric, and you'll end up with really funny shaped designs. So if you pull at the corners, that works really well. And you want it to be drum tight, so if I just bring this up to the microphone, you should be able to hear how tight this is. So I'm going to start by putting in my stem. I've got 2 strands of my mid-green thread here, and we're going to do this with a stem stitch. I've just knotted the end of my thread, bringing it through at the very end of the stem, and I want to travel forward 1 stitch length and take the needle down. Then I'm going to rock the needle so that it comes out halfway between where the thread comes out and where the needle first goes in. So I travel forward 1 stitch and rock back half a stitch length so that the needle's coming out in the middle. And when I pull through, I should be able to form a T shape with my thread there. So I've made a stitch and the working thread comes out below it. So I'm going to take my thread back over the top, and I want to go forward half a stitch length beyond the end of that first stitch, and this time I'm going to rock my needle back to the end of that first stitch so that it comes out joined up to the stitch that I started with. Pull through to make that T again, take the thread over the top, go half a stitch length forward, rock back to the end of the previous stitch and pull through. And that's as simple as it gets, really. That's what I do all the way along this line, just travelling forward half a stitch length, rocking back to the end of the previous stitch and pulling through. And I just need to make sure that I'm taking my thread over the top of the stitches each time I make one, so that the stitches all lie really nicely together. It forms a kind of rope design and it just looks really lovely. It's a great stitch for outlining, and I mean it's called stem stitch, so it couldn't be better for stems of flowers. At the end I want to go just into the petal and rock back to the edge of the petal, and then I can take my needle back through and secure it on the back. And I am going to stitch each line of stem separately so that I haven't got loads of trailing threads on the back. If I bring this up close, you should be able to see that sort of rope effect and the raised line that this creates. It's a lovely stitch. And this part of the stem is a little bit curved, and if you are working on curves, it is always better with stem stitch to reduce the length of your stitch a little bit as you're working around a curve. So just keep your stitches really short and close together and you'll get a neat line. If you make them too long, your line will end up looking quite angular. You'll end up with lots of little triangles instead of a solid line. So I'm going to put all those lines of stem in, and that's that part of the stitching done. Got those lovely solid lines that are a little bit raised. Works really well. So now I'm going to start on the leaves. I'll start with this leaf here, and I'm going to use a fishbone stitch for this. I love this stitch for leaves. It's a great one. It's fairly easy and it gives a beautiful leaf-like finish. So we're going to work both down the centre of the leaf and around the outside. I'm going to start by bringing my thread up at the very tip of the leaf and making a straight stitch down that centre line, down the middle like that. That centre line is going to form the central vein down the middle of the leaf, but it will happen all by itself. So I'm bringing up my needle on the outside edge of the leaf, on the left hand side just below that first straight stitch, and I'm going to make a longer diagonal stitch over to the right. So I'm going to cross over that first straight stitch, coming up top left and going down bottom right over on the right hand side of that centre stitch. You keep them really close together and pull through, and this time I'm going to come up on the right hand side of that centre stitch, just on the edge of the leaf, and I'm going to go down on the left hand side of that straight stitch, just working a little bit lower, and then I simply repeat that right and left diagonal all the way down the length of the leaf. So I come back up on the left hand side just below the previous stitch and go down over to the right, and then I come up on the right hand side just below the previous stitch and go down on the left. So I'm always working a kind of long cross stitch over that centre line that I started, and I'm going to work all the way down to the bottom of the leaf shape where it meets that petal that's over the top. Now, when I get to the bottom and I can't cross over anymore, I'm just going to do some satin stitch on the left hand side of the leaf and the right hand side, just where the leaf drops down below that petal on the left hand side. So that just means I'm going to do straight stitches that are lying right next to each other to form a solid fill. So I just work one stitch after another, trying to keep the same angle as the fishbone stitches that are above it, and I'm just going to work my way down and fill in that little space down to the right hand side of the leaf. And that's the finish that fishbone stitch gives you. It's just a lovely stitch. So I'm going to repeat that process with all the other leaves, and it doesn't matter if you've got a sort of feathery edge on your leaf, it works exactly the same way. Just keep following the outside line of the leaves that you are working with and it'll all just work out fine. So once I've filled my leaves, I'm going to put some little contrasting veins over the top. So I've got a single strand of my darkest green here, and I'm just going to put a long straight stitch down the middle and then some straight stitches up each side of the leaf, working at a similar angle to the stitches that have filled the leaf shape in. And I'm just going to put some leaf veins in really simply. There's no sort of guide for this, you just put them in however you think looks right. And I'm going to vary the shade of green, so I'm going to do a couple of leaves in my lightest green, and I'm always just going to use one shade of green below. So if I use light green, I'll use my mid green for the veins. If I use my mid green, I'll use my darkest green for the veins. That's it close up. Hopefully you can see the way that looks. So I'm going to fill in the rest of the leaves and then we'll be ready to stitch our flowers. Right, so that's all my leaves in, and I've put the leaf veins in as well, and so now we're going to stitch the flowers, and we're going to do a bit of a cheats thread painting here. This is a way of getting a blended tonal finish on a petal, but we're going to cheat a little bit. So I've already blended some thread. I've got one strand of my red and one strand of my pink threaded into my needle, and I'm starting at the centre of the petal and I'm going to fill it with a satin stitch. So you can see here that I'm bringing my needle up right at the top of that petal and laying my thread side by side, making each stitch right next to the previous one so there are no gaps in between them. This takes a bit of time and it's quite thread hungry, so obviously making the full length of the stitch on the back as well as the front, but it is the best way to get a good finish. So we're just making sure our threads lay right next to each other without any gaps. And you can see already, I'm so sorry that I'm right at the bottom of the screen there, I don't know what I was doing. It was very late at night. Yeah, you can see there you've already got that sort of tonal blended look because we've already blended the threads. So it's a way of getting a blend in your colour without any hassle at all. Every now and again you can rub your needle over the surface and that helps the threads sit really nicely. So now I'm just going to emphasise that shading and I'm going to make the petal a bit darker at the bottom. I've got a single strand of red here and I'm just putting some straight stitches in that go just on the top half of that petal as it's getting close to the flower centre, and I'm trying to make these stitches follow the line of the previous layer, and this is just going to make that centre of the flower a little bit darker, looking like the petals are receding as they go into the flower centre. So it's just a single strand, straight stitches that are tucked in amongst the satin stitches that I've already made. And now I've got a single strand of my pink thread, and I'm going to do exactly the same on the very tip of the petal, so this outside rounded edge. I'm going to put in straight stitches in pink, again following the lines of the stitches that are below them and just adding a little bit of highlight to the tip of the petal. I've just filled in all those petals. I've just done the pink in exactly the same way. I blended some pink and white, and then I've done the tips of the petals with white and the centre with pink, and you can see the effect that's created there. So all of them are done exactly the same, and then I've just gone round to the centre just to emphasise the dark at the centre. On the red flower I used a single strand of my darkest green, and I've just put in some little dark lines there, and on my pink flower I used my mid green just to emphasise shadow at the centre of the flower. So I've done one of the flower centres just as a demonstration. I'm going to show you how I got that shading in. So I've threaded my needle up with 3 strands. I've got 2 strands of yellow here and 1 strand of my mid green, and that's going to help me shade that bottom part of the flower centre, and we're going to work around this bottom edge first. So I'm going to bring my needle through right at the edge of the flower centre, and I want to hold my thread towards myself nice and taut and rest my needle on that thread. Then I'm going to wrap my thread over the needle twice and just hold it there with my finger so that the wraps don't fall off the end. And I'm going to take the point of my needle back down just slightly away from where the thread came up, and I want that working thread really taut, so you can see I'm holding on to it, and as I hold it taut the wraps around the needle drop down and sit on the surface of the fabric. And I'm going to keep hold of that thread until the very last minute as I pull my needle through, and that pulls my stitch into a really nice neat knot that sits beautifully against the surface of the fabric. So let me just show you that again. I'm going to bring my thread through, hold my thread taut and rest my needle on the thread, wrap twice, hold on to those wraps as I take the needle back down through the fabric, catching a couple of threads of fabric, and then I'm going to keep that thread taut as I pull through. And I'm just going to keep repeating that process. Some of the knots will look more yellow, some of them will look more green, and because of that you're going to get a lovely sort of shadowed effect around the bottom half of that flower centre, and it's going to emphasise the dimensional quality of the stitching. So again, it's a bit of a cheat silk shading. It's a really easy way of getting some light and shade into your stitching without really thinking about it too much. It's a very quick approach. So blended threads can often be your best friend if you want to create depth in your work and a bit of light and shade. So I'm going to work about a third of the way up this flower centre with the shaded thread, and then the top half of the flower centre I'm going to work in just 3 strands of yellow, and that way it will look like light is catching the top part of the flower centre. So that's my flower centre with my shading in, and that's the flowers done. So now we're going to stitch in our lettering. I'm going to start with this feather stitch house at the bottom, and we're going to do this really simply just with some back stitch, and you can whip this afterwards if you want to, depends how neat your back stitching is. If you've got really neat back stitch you won't need to whip it, but if your back stitch is a bit wobbly and you want to even up the letters, you can go through again with a single strand of thread, just taking your thread underneath each stitch. I'll put a video at the top of the screen where we've done whipped back stitch lettering before, so that you can go and check that out. Back stitch, we come up leaving a space and work back to fill in the stitch. So you can see me there coming up at the outside edge of the top of the F and working back to the vertical of the F, and the same again on that second bar. And when you're doing rounded letters like this E, you need to just make sure your stitches are kept really small and that you don't try and cover too big a gap in one stitch, because you'll end up with a really angular letter. So that's how I've done those letters at the bottom. And then at the top, because I want chunkier letters, I'm actually going to use a chain stitch here. So I've brought my thread up and I'm taking my needle down at the same point where the thread came up. That creates a loop, and take my needle through that loop. So you can see my thread's looped around the bottom there. Take my needle down, up inside that loop and pull through, and that creates a really nice thick line. And I'm keeping these stitches really small, so I think I've got 5 stitches down the length of that vertical of the D. And when you've got a corner, it's always better to finish your line by just hopping over your last chain stitch to put in a little anchor stitch, and then bringing up your thread again to start a new line. If you try and do a sharp angle by just carrying on your chain stitch, you'll get oddly shaped letters. They won't be very well defined. So I've just started my line again to make that curve, and you'll be able to see that you can stitch around a curve with chain stitch really nicely. It gives a lovely solid line with no sort of angles or corners on it. You get a really smooth curve. The trick with this is to keep your stitches really small because the lettering's quite small. And again, if you want to, you can whip this, but I think you'll probably find you won't need to. So that's my D. You can see how lovely and chunky and thick that line is. So that's all my stitching done. And so now I want to attach this to my background. And what I want to do is just fold back the excess fabric to those corner markers that I put in place at the beginning. And this is probably why a water erase pen would be better, because I managed to get the top and bottom done, but then obviously the lines had erased and I couldn't work out where the outer edges were along the left and right. So I am going to bring my pattern back in at the moment. I think I had a marker that allowed me to do one side. So I finger press it first and then go over it with the iron, and obviously as I'm doing this I'm erasing all of the pen marks as well. So if you're not sure where your outer edges should be, you can just rest it on the pattern again and just measure it that way, or just put your boundaries back in, and then I'm just going to press gently over the top, and that's our seed packet. That's the size and shape it should be. So I'm bringing back in my fabric for the background, and I'm just going to lay it on my pattern. I know you can't see through it, but let me show you how I positioned it. So I'm going to roughly lay my seed packet where I think it should be, and if I fold back my fabric I can just match up the corners there. So I just want to find a couple of corners and the other two will correct themselves, and when I'm happy with the position I can just pop a pin in to hold it in place. So I'm going to do that on all four sides. Once I've got the left hand side positioned, the right hand, I just know that the right hand side is correct, and it's not the end of the world for this one. So now I'm going to stitch it on using an applique stitch. So I've got a single strand of my white thread here, and I've brought it up through both layers. Then I want to tuck my needle tightly against the edge of my seed packet and go back down just through the red fabric. So up through both layers and then down just through the red with the needle tucked right up against that white fabric so that I don't have big stitches going onto the backing fabric. Couldn't be simpler really. So I'm just going to stitch all the way around like this. You can see me there using my thumb to smooth out the fabric as I'm going, just to make sure I'm stitching it down flat without any lumps and bumps. So every now and again you'll see me just smooth along it with my thumb, and that just gives you a really lovely finish. So once I'd stitched it all down, I thought it needed just something a little bit extra at the edge. So I've got two strands of my blue thread, that's Anchor 130, and I'm just going to put a line of running stitch around the outside. Running stitch, super simple, just bring the thread through the fabric, go along a bit and go back down, and then go along a bit and come back up, and go along a bit and go back down. And running stitch always looks better if the stitches are longer than the spaces between them. It's a much better finish that way. And keeping them a bit small, I think they're about 3mm long, my stitches. I wanted them to be quite delicate. And I just stitch all the way around the outside edge just inside the white fabric just to finish it a little bit more. And you can add whatever extra stitching you like to this. So you could do a little bit of seed stitch on the white fabric, you could do another quote. We've put some quotes all around our quilt, so if you wanted to put another quote on the red fabric you can. It's entirely up to you. And I should say that I've written Feather Stitch House Garden Quilt 2023. You could put whatever you want at the bottom. It's almost like my signature on the quilt. So that's our finished block. We've got our cheat silk shaded flowers and our lettering, and we've got our lovely little seed packet to add to our quilt topper, and so that's it. Can't wait to see your versions. Do share them at hashtag FSH23quilt. If you've enjoyed this, please do give us a like. It really helps us out. It helps other people find our videos as well. If you have enjoyed this and you want a similar project, I'll link some videos over here. And if you are enjoying our content and want to see more of it, just click on our logo down here. It makes it really easy for you to subscribe. Have a super week making your seed packet block, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Bye.